One of the things that they wanted to talk about, and this was what Chris raised the question with me about, was the renovation of this space. We knew it back in the 60s and 70s when we all came here as the sanctuary. But in later years, and even before that time, it was being referred to somewhat as the worship commons. But I'd like you to get somewhat of a picture of what it was like in the 70s when we were preparing to make some changes. When you came into the sanctuary in those days, you'd be greeted by rows of pews that would be in the same position every Sunday, row upon row upon row. I think there were about 12 rows. My memory isn't that good. And down one side from the door behind me here went an aisle that went all the way to the front of the sanctuary, just a bit about even with the pulpit. And then from the other door, another aisle that went down that became just about even with the lectern. And then on each side, of course, were aisles that facilitated seating and taking of the offering and so forth. The room was quite different. It was very dark. Much of the paneling was in walnut, as were the pews. The paint, as I remember, the light-colored paint was not quite as white as it is today. And it was just a different place. Let's take a look at some of the changes that were made. For instance, over here on the far side of the sanctuary, where we now hang worship information, sometimes artwork, a place that's surrounded by a brown trim railing or frame. Behind that wall is a room. Referred to politely as the balcony, was really called the wart by most people. We decided early in the process of thinking about changes here that the wart would go. And I think you would agree with me that it's a very suitable change and provides us a space for good wall decoration. Now down at the front is where the major change really took place. To the left, where the organ sits now on most Sundays, was a large choir loft. Matching it, and I think almost the same size and dimension, was the baptistry, much bigger than the baptistry that we have here today. In between was a platform. Now that platform was level with the bottom of the doors that go into what we call the heritage room. I would guess that the platform stood about probably 24 to 30 inches high. There were 3 steps as you went up, 2 steps and then the step onto the platform. That gives you an idea of the height. The walls that went around the choir loft and the baptistry were much higher than the one wall that exists today around the baptistry. In between, where we now have the children's tree, was a large opening. In those days it was square, and it was simply a very heavy red or maroon drape that hung to the floor. On that drape usually was a very attractive bronze gold-colored cross. Now the question often comes up when we describe these changes to people, why did you do this? Why did you make these changes? We'd have to say that the first reason is the context of the times. Not only in Central Baptist, but in churches all across the country, the format of church life, the format of worship was becoming much more informal, much more contemporary. People were beginning to be open to new ways of approaching worship, and CBC was caught up in that trend. Late in the 60s, or maybe not till the 70s, we started having 2 worship services. One took place in the Hall of Banners, was an informal or contemporary service. The other took place in this space as we knew it at the time, the row upon row and so forth. After several years of the services, 2 services, one being informal, contemporary, the other traditional, we realized that a result was occurring that we didn't really care for, and that is that it was dividing the congregation. We were really becoming 2 congregations. So the question was raised, could we, in one setting, combine the nature of the 2 services and have one that would both offer what the people who value the first service would find there, and the more traditional as well? Could we put the contemporary and the traditional together? Well, the immediate response was, but where? Not downstairs, not upstairs, not the way the upstairs is. We can't do it. This was happening, as I said, all across the country, and so roughly in the early 70s, they started talking, the mid 70s, I guess I would say, they started talking about the renovation of this space. Finally, in 1979, a renovation committee was appointed, and they started the serious work that led to what we have today. Why we did it? Yeah, the two services, the divided congregation, but at the same time, we realized that in a new setting, we could do two things. We could increase the real sense of community of the congregation, of the people who belong to CBC, of their interaction, their talking with each other, their experiencing each other in the acts of worship and so forth. Rather than sitting in rows and simply seeing the backs of the heads in front of you, you would see faces and smiles and body language telling, this is my reaction to what's happening in worship. That was the one reason, the community. The other was a setting for a suitable sense of worship. Perhaps the best statement was in the letter that went to the congregation proposing this whole activity. It said, increasingly we saw that we were creating beautiful as well as functional space, which could both help people feel close to one another, but also help their souls to soar. We believe what is proposed will be such a space, and that the provision of such space is a significant commitment to God's mission.